Good morning, everyone. I'm Liz with the Vermont Land Trust, and on behalf of the Vermont Land Trust's ecology and forestry staff and all of us, I want to welcome you and to this presentation this morning. Really excited to do this. I want to start by acknowledging the Open Space Institute, who is funding this work in part, and really appreciate their support of this important work. And also our partners at the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation and Conservation Science Partners, who are part of a team of people with Tony and Paul, our presenters, and Vermont Land Trust, working together on a document on this topic of managing for old growth characteristics. Tony and Paul together have worked on publications and much research related to this in the past and have produced publications, but this new publication due in September will be an update to that to those publications, and we're really excited about this new publication. So stay tuned about that. To introduce the two speakers, Tony D'Amato is professor of silviculture and applied forest ecology and director of the forestry program at the University of Vermont. His research focuses on long-term forest dynamics, disturbance effects on ecosystem structure and function, and silvicultural strategies for conferring adaptation potential within the context of global change, including introduced insects and diseases. I know of his work with emerald ash borer has been so important to many of us here in the Northeast in particular. Paul Catanzaro is associate professor and state extension forester at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's also the director of Family Forest Research Center, a partnership of the USDA Forest Service and UMass Amherst. Paul's research and outreach work focuses primarily on understanding and informing family forest owner decisions about the intergenerational transfer of their land and stewardship of their forests. I'm delighted to be working with these two wonderful people and want to just welcome them. So thanks very much, Tony and Paul, for being here today, and take it away.
Thanks, Liz, for that introduction, and thanks everybody for logging on. It's awesome to see just this real wide interest from folks. And so those that don't know me, Tony D'Amato, and I'm really the opening act for the person you really want to hear from, Paul Catanzaro, who will be presenting for the second part of this. And part of that division really reflects that we recognize there's a real diverse group that's logging in today, folks that are foresters, landowners, land trusts with a lot of different interests. And so our goal today really is to just cover some basics as it relates to kind of why we're even thinking about managing for old growth characteristics, and then getting into just some strategies that might intersect with either landowners or foresters and others that are making decisions about the land in the Northeast. So as Liz mentioned, really, why are we here now? In many cases, really a major tip of the hat to Liz in particular, and David McMath of Vermont Land Trust, who really reached out to us over 2 years ago now to just mention the potential for revisiting some of these ideas that were building upon work that was happening in the Northeast already with Bill Keaton, and certainly that was building upon work that Craig Lorimer and others have been doing in the Lake States on this idea that can we actually actively manage forests to restore old growth characteristics. And so one of the reasons for why now is that it's been a while since these documents came out. Certainly things have changed in terms of our understanding of forests, our understanding of how to manage forests for these conditions, as well as some of the reasons for actually doing this in terms of the objectives that we have now for the region's ecosystems. And so, as Liz mentioned, our goal really with this presentation is to highlight some of the things that haven't changed as it relates to the original publication, but also some of the new ideas and approaches to this, as well as kind of foreshadow what will be a much more dense and detail-filled publication coming out this fall. But as I mentioned, really the motivation for those original pamphlets was driven by the recognition that old growth forests really were the predominant forest condition across the Northeast at the time of European settlement. We know this from many different accounts, and I'll certainly be using historical accounts in a little bit just to highlight what those forests may have looked like. And so the rationale originally for restoring old growth characteristics to the region is that we knew these were very abundant, and at the same time, they're extremely rare today. States like Massachusetts, it's 1/10% of all forests in Massachusetts is old growth, and that percentage doesn't get better when we get to the broader region. It's about 0.4% is old growth. But we know it was a critical feature in the landscape in terms of habitat values, certainly cultural values. And so that really, in many cases, was the primary motivation. What are we lacking from our landscape by not having that now? But what's occurred really over the last 10 years as we've thought about declines in regional biodiversity, certainly thought about carbon storage and kind of what big trees and a lot of dead wood means for storing carbon in the forest, as well as just having a diversity of structures and composition and all those features that we associate with old growth, that many of those attributes are very consistent with these contemporary goals we now have as around global change resilience and other attributes. And so revisiting this with that lens is really critical in that we still know we need this forest type in the landscape, given how rare it is, yet historically important. At the same time, there's many features of this forest that now can help us solve these future challenges. So before we get into spending the rest of the presentation really talking about old growth forests and old forests, I think it's worth just reflecting on the fact that the forests in general as an ecosystem are so critical to all that we do here in the Northeast, whether it's our well-being, certainly clean water, clean air, carbon storage. And so there's been a real shift definitely in the last few years as we've thought a lot about climate change mitigation towards old forests and old forests only. And that's really the priority of most efforts for conservation. What I think people need to recalibrate on is that we need all forests and all forests are really critical. And it hasn't been a good couple of decades as it relates to anybody that cares about forests. And to that point, this figure on the left is actually, at this point, outdated data, right? This is 2000 to 2010, kind of the average acreage lost per year to development in this portion of New England. And the average across that region, based on the work by the Harvard Forest, is 26,500 acres per year being lost with forest. Unfortunately, I don't want to be a real downer here, but I project that the next update on this number is going to be even worse, just given what we've been observing as it relates to the amount of development occurring, particularly in large forested blocks in relation to people kind of finding their COVID retreat in the middle of the wilderness. And so, when we think about arguing for certain forest conditions, I think the first thing we all need to channel our energy into is we need to keep forest. And that's, I think, should be a pretty critical priority. Similarly, though many are aware of what's been happening globally, but also regionally as it relates to bird diversity, other species diversity trends. And again, unfortunately, these numbers are going down in terms of the species that we're seeing in their abundance in the landscape. And so this is some data from Vermont based on bird monitoring that Vermont Center for Eco Studies has been doing. And many of the reasons for these declines certainly linked to changes in land use, what's happening on some of those land uses in terms of the impacts on invertebrates that are critical food sources for many of these species. But another aspect driving these declines in diversity are just the lack of heterogeneity in habitats on our landscape. And so that includes certainly this beautiful kind of old forest on the right, but also includes this complex young forest on the left. And so we need to have kind of a mix of conditions if we want to sustain our region's biodiversity. And the final comment as it relates to old growth forests and old forests and how that discussion has been cast recently is that it's often been viewed as a way to eliminate harvesting from given regions or given ownerships. And the reality exists that we are tremendous consumers, all of us, every day, including today. I'm sure if you brushed your teeth, there's likely some cellulose in that toothpaste. We are consuming wood products on a daily basis, and in many cases at higher rates, particularly as it relates to things like packaging and so forth. And so if we look at our region and think about how much wood we locally produce relative to what we consume, this graph here is just showing kind of consumption relative to removals. And there's really only one New England state, Maine, that actually is removing or harvesting more wood than they consume. But the region as a total really is a net exporter of our wood demands to other regions of the country, other regions of the globe. And so if we really want to be global citizens and think about how our resource consumption impacts global ecosystems, carrying more of that local weight as it relates to producing wood products is critical. And so we need all forests for many reasons, including providing this local source of sustainable material. So what I'm going to do, and you've noticed even in terms of what was advertised and what we call our presentation, there's some differences in terminology that get thrown around as it relates to old growth forests, old forests, second growth forests. And so I'm just going to kind of present the terminology that we're using for this presentation, for the historic publications, for the upcoming publication, just so folks are aware of what we're talking about. And importantly also, just to, I think, in many cases, give true value to the unique ecosystems that are old growth. There really are some aspects of those that are just incredible and I think sometimes get watered down when we lump everything into this old forest category. And so when we're talking about old growth, we are really talking about forests that were never directly impacted by intensive human land uses. And in particular, we're talking about those intensive human land uses that were brought on by European settlement. So land clearing for agriculture, widespread widespread harvesting of wood. And so what this definition acknowledges is that these are systems that really were governed by natural processes, and so are a good benchmark for kind of what the natural expression of the ecosystems are for a region. But importantly, it does acknowledge that practices like indigenous burning that were happening on the landscape may have impacted these areas, but those impacts were quite different and in many cases in sync with the ecology of those ecosystems relative to what the European settlement did with land clearing and so forth. To that end, what we now have as a result of that very intensive land use are second growth forests. And so forests that established following that intensive land use, and in many cases that are quite homogeneous and quite different from old growth. And then where things get a little bit muddy is we have this term old forest that's increasingly used, partly because old growth is a historic term, but in many cases, really does have some true scientific value. And so old forest is a much broader term that's really used for forests that have a critical mass of these characteristics that we associate with old growth, but in most cases could never become old growth because they're starting from a place that was impacted by humans. And so there are going to be attributes of that forest that just never are going to approximate what we see in a true old growth system. And so our goal with these strategies we're going to talk about today is that we are really trying to manage towards old forest conditions. We're really trying to restore old growth characteristics that finally reach some critical mass that actually is approximating some of the attributes that we're interested in sustaining on the landscape. A final comment on that in terms of terminology, and just for folks to get a picture of the second growth across the region. And I've shown this figure a lot. I know those that have been put to sleep by previous presentations by me. But what we're looking at here are just the different forest inventory and analysis plots. So each color represents a different age of that plot. And this is great work that Mark Ducey and others did. And it's 10 years old, so you can add 10 years to the ages if you want. Still not going to improve the narrative that much of our forests in the Northeast, depending on where you are, in northern Maine, a bit younger, but we're really ranging from 60 to 100 years old. So very, very young ecosystems. And what's happened really in the last few weeks actually is we're now starting to call these are actually mature ecosystems because they're 70 to 100 years old. But what we're talking about is basically 1/4 on average the lifespan of most of our tree species. And so when we're looking at these ecosystems, these are ecologically young second growth forests. They might be mature in our eyes, just given it's a 70-year-old or 90-year-old tree. But if we think about old growth forests, the longevity of these trees and the many life cycles of trees that have happened in an old growth forest, lumping in 70 to 100-year-old forests with old growth or even mature ecosystems, I think is pretty disingenuous to really the true intent of us thinking ecologically about old systems. So what I'm going to do is go through just some review. Those that saw the webinar from last June, almost a year to the date on this, we kind of gave a bit more detail about old growth forests and kind of some of the characteristics. And I'm going to revisit just a couple of key concepts that are important as we think through restoring old growth characteristics and what that might mean where you are in a given landscape and kind of how that might influence the management actions we do. And so to do that, I'm going to start off with something I think is always critical to recognize, and that is when we look at historic accounts of old growth, whether it's some of Nichols' work in Connecticut, here's a photo of an old growth stand in Connecticut, or the work by Harvard Forest in New Hampshire. This is an old growth forest in Western Massachusetts. These color photos were taken by me of old growth forests in New Hampshire and New York and in Massachusetts. What these photos really represent is that we have a very biased view of old growth. And in particular, and I always like to point this out, if I'm going to take a picture in an old growth forest and try to demonstrate something that to me is very unique about that ecosystem and compelling, it are the large trees that these ecosystems have. And so when we look at old growth and we take pictures of old growth and we perpetuate ideas about old growth, we often are kind of perpetuating this notion that it's wall-to-wall giant trees. And I'm as equally guilty of that as these historic photos, right? I made sure that the one big tree in this picture here is getting taken. But if you look behind that, there's a lot of variability. There's not a lot of giant trees around that one individual tree. And so big trees are a very important part of old growth. And I think emotionally, some of our connections to old growth is we like these big old trees, but that really is a slice of the variety that exists in these ecosystems. And what is common and should be a feature that you think about when you think about old growth is variability, and variability in space, variability in time, ranges of conditions over short spans of distance. And so this picture here is an old growth stand in the Adirondacks, and you can see it quite well. We have some big old trees, we have some dead wood, but there's a real range of variety in this given photo. And so instead of me putting someone next to one big tree and taking a picture here, you can see that variation. And so just to drive that point home, I'm just going to share some historic quotes of some of the accounts of old growth in the region, given really, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of existing old growth to demonstrate these things, but just to reflect on just some of the observations people were making of old growth in the Northeast at the time, where there still were some stands to look at. And so the first comes from Connecticut. Those that get Northern Woodland magazine, conveniently, there's a summary of some of this work in this current issue. But this comes from Nichols' work, where basically he was sadly documenting old growth stands right before they were being harvested. And basically talking about the big trees in those stands, he says they by no means constitute a plurality. In most virgin woodlands, the stand here is an uneven age, so that every stage in development and deterioration is present, from the slender saplings to the rotting logs with which the ground is strewn on all sides. So really speaking to that spatial variability that exists across that ecosystem and describing this within the state of Connecticut. Likewise, one of the larger surveys of old growth across the landscapes in southern New Hampshire, done by many researchers of the Harvard Forest, but summarized here by Al Klein and Steve Spur. Large trees were common, it's true, but the majority of the stands were undoubtedly in a state of flux, resulting from the dynamic action of wind, fire, and other forces of nature. These forces, coupled with site factors, made the virgin forest highly variable in composition, density, and form. And so again, the picture that we all take of that big giant tree, rightfully so, we need to honor those veterans, and it's an amazing part of an ecosystem. But it's this variability that's, I think, a real critical factor that we need to think about when we're thinking about management and what our goals are for these ecosystems. At the same token, even in my own thinking, because I'm certainly one that really loves northern hardwood forests and spruce fir forests, really mesic, wet systems that are often closed canopy. But when we reflect again, both on the influence of indigenous people on historic forest conditions, as well as the influence of different site factors, not all old growth forests are closed canopy stands. In many cases, some of the early accounts also include woodlands, more open kind of old growth forest systems that are a bit different than many of the archetypes that we hold up. And again, to go back to Connecticut and Nichols' work, he was describing a stand in Stonington, Connecticut, and basically, saying it doesn't have that kind of what we often call the climax association of hemlock, beech, sugar maple. The stand is of a more open character and resembles the climax oak hickory type of the Chicago region. Those familiar with that part of the world, we're talking about more of those bur oak woodland types. Ground is not deeply shaded, low dense underbrush, quite xerophytic. So we're really talking about what we might see in these oak woodlands today that often have blueberry and other species in the understory. And a final point on that, Bromley did a lot of work, in particular, talking about the influence of indigenous people on forests in southern New England. It really speaks to the fact that the original open forest type is the direct antithesis of the present day type of brush or coppice, which is characteristic of southern New England. And so again, very different than what we often view as like this closed canopy, dark ecosystem. So what I'm going to get into and then hand it off to Paul is if we're interested in that spatial variability, if we're interested in kind of restoring attributes of these old growth ecosystems, there are a couple key things to keep in mind. First is, what ecosystem are you in? Am I in an ecosystem that may have actually resembled more of an open woodland, or am I in a northern hardwood forest that probably was more closed canopy? And so just thinking about the site and the forest types it can support is critical. But also, how does it fit into your overall goals as a landowner or as a forester working for a larger ownership? And so is it a primary goal that you're really going to do everything you can to restore attributes of old growth forest to that ecosystem? Or is it a goal that kind of fits into your broader portfolio of goals for your land, such that you might be interested in doing certain things that will get old growthness back to your ecosystem, but it's not necessarily going to be the only thing you do? And so what I'm going to present really are kind of a range of approaches you can take. It's not the be all end all list. I guess you can wait for the pamphlet for at least a broader list. Still won't be the be all end all list, but what I want to do is just highlight some broad approaches, and then Paul will talk a bit more about how those approaches fit into your ownership objectives, as well as other considerations that intersect with this in terms of land tenure and so forth. So the first way to restore old growth characteristics is to let nature take its course, right? And we call this a passive approach to restoring old growth characteristics. And essentially what this entails is that you're establishing a wildland on a portion of a property or the entire property, where the goal is really to allow natural processes to restore old growth characteristics over time. And what's critical, and really what motivated the original publication that Paul and I developed in 2007, is that we were concerned about where we currently existed with our current forests. And many people were saying, I'm just going to leave my forest alone because I want old growth. And basically we said, no, actually, if you want old growth and you want it now and you want to deal with some of these issues, active restoration might be a better way to get there more quickly and intersect with those linear goals. And so That's not to say there's not a lot of value in doing this, but the key element is you need to recognize it's going to take a long time to get there. And really, you're going to rely on processes like this blowdown to create those structures and rely on your own knee-jerk reaction to go clean that blowdown up. You can't be removing those critical elements, and you have to rely on disturbance to generate them for you. So Paul will talk more about it, but it also means that well after your lifespan, you need to make sure that somebody else is keeping that as a wildland preserve that's not going to be impacted. The other aspect of this is that, again, as this notion of old forest and old growth forest has become popularized, there's been, I think in some cases, a disingenuous discussion that if I designate an area as old forest, it's going to become old forest the next day. And so that doesn't acknowledge that the time span it takes to develop these structures, but it also doesn't acknowledge that not every stand really is on a trajectory that will allow it to develop those large trees, large dead wood, complex canopy structures. And in particular, we have a lot of conditions like this stand here that's just dominated, wall-to-wall buckthorn, Asiatic bittersweet, other species, that as these trees die, they're not going to be replaced by future tree species. And so that isn't going to kind of go on a trajectory towards old growth conditions. Likewise, we have stands that are kind of a relic of historic plantations, so really high density stands that haven't been thinned. So there's low vigor trees that are not built to last in terms of growing into those large dimensions. And then finally, we have certain dynamics like this diseased beech stand, where as much as I'd love for this beech tree to reach 40 inches in diameter, unfortunately, given the dynamics of beech bark disease, it's just never going to be able to reach that unless beech bark disease disappears from our landscape, which unfortunately does not seem like that's going to happen. And so if you're designating an area for passive management, really choosing areas where it's likely to occur over time, given current conditions. So what I'll talk more about are active approaches. Again, as I mentioned, that was really the motivation for a lot of this work originally. And in many cases, the motivation beyond certainly Paul and I both getting excited about active forest management for many reasons, is that we recognize, and many others have recognized, that many of the things that we care about as it relate to old growth forests that are lacking from current forests can actually be restored more quickly with management approaches that are accelerating the growth of trees to make them larger or increasing the amount of dead wood in the forest for spatial heterogeneity. In addition, as we think about climate adaptation and resilience of these ecosystems, as well as habitat goals, when we're doing active management, we're planning for things like regeneration and thinking about what's coming back in that stand. The passive approach, we really are in many cases accepting largely shade tolerant regeneration over time, depending on how large those disturbances are. And so by doing active management, we might have some control over what species come back on that stand and how that might intersect with their resilience to future change over time. So what I'm going to do is just go through kind of some common attributes that we're often interested in managing for in old growth, and just talk briefly. I'm not going to go into too much detail. The pamphlet will certainly have more of that in there, and in previous presentations have had more of that in there. But if we're trying to actively restore elements of old growth forest into second growth forest, how do we go about doing that? And so the first thing, if you're interested in restoring old growth attributes actively, the first thing you need to be considering is, how do I take what is largely a homogeneous ecosystem, both in terms of the spatial arrangement of trees, the age structure, in many cases the composition, and increase the heterogeneity, in particular the spatial variation in density and size across that site. And so what we're really trying to do are combine removals of individual trees and groups of canopy trees while also retaining some mature trees, and doing that in the form of a regeneration method. So what we're really talking about are using approaches like single tree and group selection, irregular shelter woods, variable density thinning, all approaches that really are designed to both recruit cohorts, but also introduce some variability across that stand in terms of spatial structure and composition. And doing that with natural canopy disturbances as our guide. And so openings ranging from 1/10 of an acre to a ½ acre, if we're doing uneven age approaches, or even emulating some mesoscale disturbances, 1 to 3 acre openings with retention to introduce those structures. And so to give you just a couple of examples of that, this is a LiDAR image. So the hot colors are taller trees, the blue are gaps, and then the green are actually areas that have been thinned. And so this is a 25 acre northern hardwood stand that was just treated with hybrid single tree group selection. So we have a mix of 1/4 acre openings, 1/10 acre openings, and in between those openings, there's thinning to accelerate tree growth, so to get those large trees fast, as well as areas that are actually being permanently protected as kind of patch reserves. So within this 25 acre area, you've gone from a fairly homogeneous unit to now introducing a lot of spatial variability, after that initial entry. Likewise, on the right, same idea. This is a 50-acre area. And in here, they're emulating kind of the influence of what a downburst might do naturally in a stand. So we have these 1 and 3 acre openings. They're still retaining trees in those openings, so kind of showing that retention that often occurs following disturbance. They're leaving behind areas that aren't being harvested, and they're also thinning between these areas. And so creating a lot of spatial variability in a small area to give you that template. So both of those are northern hardwood examples. And this picture in the middle is a spruce fir forest that, again, was treated with variable density thinning. So we have openings, we have thinned areas, we have protected areas, all in a very small area, giving us that spatial variability that really sets the trajectory for that forest going forward, to have some of those elements that old growth forests were so commonly documented as containing. One of the things that we talk a lot about is our large old trees. And so I'm going to go through several attributes, and each of these I'm going to present what we call benchmarks. And what these benchmarks represent are essentially what we know from existing old growth forests are the conditions in old growth forests in terms of these attributes. So for large old trees, we know based on lots of work that in northern hardwood old growth ecosystems, we have 12 to 20 trees greater than 20 inches in diameter. Not a common feature on our landscape today. And so again, these are benchmarks. And if we talk about old forests, these are some of the characteristics we're hoping to accumulate in those systems over time that that represent these old growth conditions. And so this one is fairly straightforward for the foresters in the room. If we want large trees, we're pros in that, right? We can grow trees quickly, accelerate their growth. And in particular, we're looking at crop tree release or crown thinning. A lot of work has shown just the ability. Again, Craig Lorimer's work in the 90s, really did a lot of work on how to use crop tree release to accelerate old growth, forest dimensions. And just as we do with traditional crop tree release, selecting kind of not the entire stand, but 40 to 60 dominant trees per acre to release. And that density, if you're comparing numbers, and probably hard to do because we're going through these fairly quickly, that's a much higher density than what the benchmark condition is. And what that density really represents is that we know that some of these trees are going to die. That's great. We want that structure, but we also know that there's going to be future entries in these stands that either are going to commercially remove those trees or maybe cut those trees and leave them for future deadwood inputs. And so having a higher number than what your ultimate goal is really critical on this front. Likewise, leaving trees to live out their lifespan is critical. You already heard me editorialize that a 7-year-old tree is not a mature tree ecologically, right? A 207-year-old tree, that's a mature tree. And so leaving trees out there to live out their lifespan is really critical and really allows us to grow large old trees in an ecosystem. And so where you're harvesting, leaving behind legacy trees, so large diameter trees. Kevin Evans is going to regret ever being in this photo, but I use this a lot. It's beautiful, big yellow birch. That tree is, the value of that tree is in the woods. Leaving that large tree. If they have complex structures, whether it's bark structures, crown structures, or it's a species like red spruce that might be less represented in a given area, leaving those trees behind is critical. But individuals like this are not built to last. And so this tree is not going to live, 60, 70 more years and become large. And so really choosing those trees that can last on site and making sure you're documenting them, not just initially with some spray paint, but other ways to kind of permanently monument and avoid those. And certainly you can even name them, although this one's definitely going to get cut with that name on it. Similar to big living trees, we know we have a lot of dead wood in our old growth forests, and it's across a range of decay classes. So it's not just kind of all fresh wood or all highly rotted wood, it's a diversity of age classes. And so again, I'm just showing some benchmark numbers. I'm not going to belabor these, but just for kind of a gut check, an old growth northern hardwood forest is 7 to 9 cords per acre of dead wood on the ground. That's a lot of wood, right? So if your goal really is to go there and make old growth restoration your primary objective, there are going to be some trade-offs in terms of utilization of wood, right? You're going to be leaving a lot out there in a forest. So because of that, what I have parenthetically here is that if your goal is you still want to restore dead wood, which should be a goal for all of our forests, but you don't want to go kind of full hog in terms of, really approaching these old growth numbers. Dividing these numbers in two still provides kind of a complementary level of old growth attributes that could be valuable in your ecosystem. And so kind of evaluating it, how much can you leave out there and how does that fit into your other goals? And you'll notice quite a range of variability in these benchmark numbers. So how do we do that? We practice morticulture, right? So instead of just growing trees to live, we're growing trees to die, and we're deliberately killing trees and leaving them on the site. And so really kind of creating that pulse of dead wood that's critical to really jumpstarting what is a very dynamic and key part of old growth forest ecosystems. And so as an initial entry, depending on the stand conditions, felling and leaving 8 to 10 large diameter trees per acre. Again, you can choose from kind of poorer quality individual trees, right? Those cull trees by economic standards could be awesome, logs or snags. And likewise, some of those trees you've selected for crop tree release to kind of accelerate their growth ultimately might be the same trees you're choosing to fell and leave in future entries. And so what your goal is to kind of have this initial pulse of dead wood and then rely on the death of legacy trees naturally, or you in future entries kind of creating kind of those future pulses. And so the fastest way to do this, again, all of us that work in forestry are pretty good at kind of creating dead wood by cutting it and leaving it. We're just usually then removing it from the site. So operationally, that's most consistent with how we do things. But if the landowner is willing to kind of either deal with the economic trade-offs with maybe a little bit less efficiency from the operator to pull things over, push things over, that certainly is going to create kind of conditions that are more analogous to a wind throw or a blowdown. So we're available, certainly a great option as well to push over trees. One thing to really recognize, again, and Paul will talk about this as well, is that oftentimes people will think of this, well, I do it once and now I'll have old growth. But with deadwood, with many of these other attributes, they take time and they're dynamic. And with deadwood, one thing that's really key about old growth forest, and this picture on the right is another old growth stand, highlights it nicely. You really have what we call this deadwood decay continuum, from very fresh wood to well decayed wood to in between decay. And really what this represents are many different periods of death and canopy mortality in that ecosystem. And so we want to be doing similar things in that we do that initial pulse of dead wood, but then every time we're entering that stand, we're adding more dead wood to that pool so that we have this range of decay classes across that site that are critical for early on, for insects that really rely on fresh wood, later on for fungi and other organisms like salamanders that really rely on well-decayed wood. And so having that continuum is pretty critical. Besides the downed dead wood, we also know standing dead wood is super critical. Again, thinking about biodiversity declines and kind of the value of snags and cavity trees in our forests for habitat. And so those that think in terms of basal area or even just number of trees of this diameter per acre, this is a lot of basal area in the forest. And in many cases, this basal area includes both dead trees as well as declining trees. And so this might be some trees like this tree pictured here that already is very functional as a cavity tree, but still has some live crown on it. And so carrying some additional basal area in that stand for this critical feature. And so in terms of creating snags, really my thinking and many others thinking is that the best way to create future snags and cavity trees is to allow it to happen naturally. So the death of those trees that you're leaving behind as legacies really is the most ecologically effective way to create cavity trees. And as a good example, this is a living sugar maple here. You can see it's already functionally a cavity tree. It has a pocket of rot that's developed over time. So this tree naturally has features that are making it being selected by cavity nesters for use as a cavity tree. So as this declines, it's still standing for a long period of time because the tree is actually vigorous and ultimately dies. And so the longevity of that snag is much greater when it's kind of naturally occurring. So we can do things like this on the right, which is girdling this tree to deliberately create a snag. But this functionally is not going to operate as effectively as a tree that naturally dies on its own. And so it's really a decision the landowner has to make. Likewise, if you're creating snags and actually have some control over it, bearing in mind safety issues, certainly future harvests, and so making sure snag creation is factoring in those elements. So the last thing I'll mention before handing it off to Paul that we often think about in terms of old forest is that given that intensive land use, particularly agricultural clearing, that really has a dramatic impact both on the trees, but also on the soil, and very importantly, on understory plants. There are many species that are what we call dispersal limited. So they really have a hard time recolonizing disturbed areas or dispersing from kind of the areas they currently exist. And so they really are sensitive to kind of the removal of forest, and in many cases, even some of these species, large scale forest harvesting. And so if our goal is to make sure we have a high representation of these species that are dispersal limited, so some of our characteristic lichens like loberia or mosses like mechera, or even some of our understory herbs like squirrel corn, these are very slow to recover following disturbance. And so if you have those on your land, or if you have them on individual trees, I'm really trying to find ways to both kind of build on those populations and maintain those in your stand as a critical strategy for kind of actively and consciously restoring that structure. And so pretty straightforward on how to do this, but if we have areas that contain either even well-developed old growth characteristics like this beautiful pocket of decayed wood, or have kind of moss species, lichen species, understory plants that we know are sensitive to disturbance, creating reserves around those areas, or in many cases retaining those structures is pretty critical to sustain and grow in many cases those populations in your stand. So I've been kind of getting in the weeds a bit here and talking about some of these strategies. And as I mentioned, we'll talk a bit more about it in the pamphlet, but I'm going to hand the baton to Paul to talk a bit more about how this kind of fits into kind of broader goals across your landscape.
Thank you, Tony. That was great. So Tony gave us a fantastic foundation of the characteristics of old growth forest, the differences in the second growth, and some wonderful, property level, stand level strategies to get us from A to B. And I'm going to spend a few minutes now sort of trying to synthesize that, maybe give you a bit of a framework to put those strategies together, and maybe some considerations at the landscape level, and some other things to think about in terms of being successful if you're interested in restoring the old growth characteristics. This is a conceptual diagram that Tony and I put together in the original publication, I think, that we're in the process of revising. The idea here, though, is to communicate to you that there isn't one silver bullet. There isn't one prescription to go out and do on your property. Each property has a lot of variability based on its own site characteristics, its land use history, its landowners' goals, etc. So there isn't one prescription to go out and actually achieve, some of these strategies. Instead, there is a continuum. There's a variety of ways. There's a diversity of strategies in combination that one can employ to create more old growth-ness. And so we put this together to help communicate that. So the first step is to really, and Tony talked a little bit about this, what is the landowner goal here? Is the landowner goal, primary objective, and that's really to just go wholeheartedly after some old growth characteristics? Is it more of a complementary objective? In other words, it's very important, although there are other objectives that are equally important, such as wildlife or maybe timber, or is it more of a related objective? In other words, maybe that you have other primary objectives, but you like this idea and you want to incorporate a little bit of it within your management. And to do so, you can take a look at the gradient. You can decide on a variety of variability in terms of what you're keeping, in terms of these patch reserves, the number of legacy trees and so forth, and sort of calibrate that accordingly to fit into these goals. Importantly, it's not, again, this conceptual diagram isn't meant to communicate, you should pick column 1 through 4 or 5. Instead, it's more to communicate to you that there are a variety of combinations that you can use to achieve these goals by designating, an appropriate amount of patch reserves and legacy trees out there in terms of number of trees, or the basal area that would then establish sort of the anchor for these restoration areas, in between which you could then decide based on your species composition goals, how big of the patches that you're going to be doing in terms of the size of disturbance, historic range of variability, and then thinning in between that matrix. So the idea here is that it just sort of gives one, I hope, a framework to start thinking through, all right, how do we put together these various strategies into, a forest management framework? And again, really reiterating this point that it's not, there's not a singular a strategy to achieve this, that it's really, we talk about forestry as the art and the science. It's really the art and the science of reading the landscape, the landowner's goals, and putting these together in an appropriate way. And at least in our mind, one way to start thinking about that is by, clearly defining what those landowner goals are and how high of a priority and how it fits in with these other goals, because this isn't necessarily meant to be a singular goal. It is completely compatible with these other objectives. It's also compatible between active and passive, and that's a point I'm going to touch on in the next few slides. Tony, would you advance? So the other way, it is to think about this as it doesn't need to be all passive or all active. In some cases, as Tony said, that there are certainly systems out there that may be an old plantation, maybe diseased, low vigor overstory, certainly with invasive infestation, that there might be opportunities to what we say, set it and forget it. So you can put these forests with some limited active management up front, on a different successional trajectory to get it to that point through time that you can then take a hands-off approach, take a passive approach. So even within this conversation of you're going to take an active approach or a passive approach, there are ways that they are highly complementary and approaches that you can utilize to reach your goals. Next slide. So again, let's get down to some of the framework piece, the sort of boots on the ground. How might you, take these strategies that Tony talked about and apply those? So we talked about, the objectives. We talked about, that giving you a frame of reference for maybe what you're leaving in terms of basal area and legacy tree patch reserves. Where might you cite these on a property scale? Well, things like environmental variation. We want sites that are wet and dry. We want, these old growth type forests to develop in a variety of ways with a lot of diversity, different species composition, et cetera. And that means putting them on a variety of sites. Looking for areas, our forests are young, but they're sort of at that front end of accumulating some of this structure. So where are there places where there are snags, down trees, maybe a patch of wind throw that you can build off of? So when you're looking for these areas to restore and you're doing your inventory or taking a walk in your woods, those are great sites to identify and then build off of. Productive sites will grow these characteristics faster than low fertility sites. So, if you've got a nice rich site and, one of the things we're looking to do is grow big trees and grow big dead wood, then those productive sites are an excellent place to focus on. If you have other, high value resources, vernal pools, threatened endangered species, those are obviously excellent areas to build your restoration strategies off of. As Tony just talked about, areas that have wildflowers, shrubs, well-developed plant understories, those can take decades to develop. So why wait those decades? Go to those areas immediately, start building off of those areas. And as we've talked about in terms of these successional trajectories, avoiding these areas with high invasive exotic species that may hinder the successional trajectory to reach that old growth state. Next slide. So that's at the property level, but again, we live in the Northeast. Well, most of us live in the Northeast. And so we live in a highly parcelized landscape. And so it's really critical to consider the landscape context of the property or properties that you might be working on. I love this diagram, this illustration on the left. That's a puzzle piece, and it sort of matches well with the assessor's map. Each of these parcels is like a puzzle piece. And of course, our ecosystem services and values don't start and stop at stone walls. So what's going on around you as a property owner in terms of the ecological resources, maybe the intended future management, maybe the land protection status, et cetera, and how do you incorporate, those characteristics and those qualities within your thinking in the framework of forest management? This parcel that's highlighted here happens to be a parcel that Tony and I have some silvicultural plots on that we put in maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And one of the points I like to point out about this is it sits within the same landscape as a wildlife management area that's incorporating some of these strategies within their own stewardship. So that property worked out well for a number of reasons, but certainly within the landscape context, adding to some of these old growth characteristics across the landscape, across property boundaries is really important. I'll come back to that actually in the next slide, please, Tony. So I know this is a little goofy, but if you can just envision these shotgun lots as individual property owners, here's just sort of like just a range of opportunities for you as a landowner or a forester or an organization to achieve these characteristics within, some larger goals. So for example, you don't have to just regenerate tolerant species. You can if you want to, and that third panel shows that. This is an active approach that has, single tree, small gaps that's likely to favor those shade tolerant, mid-tolerant species. But on the far right, we have, a situation, an example where a landowner wants to restore some of this old growth characteristics, did a larger patch reserve to get some of those different environmental conditions in there, but really opened it up to encourage more shade intolerant species from a management goal perspective. So they're reaching both structural targets, But within this framework, you can also reach your species targets, composition targets as well. And then within the matrix there, I just have some examples of landowners taking a passive approach. And within this, if you look across the landscape, Tony, if you could just advance one, you could get the sense that, with landowners doing different strategies to achieve their own goals, incorporating some of these types of strategies provides stepping stones across the landscape for species, as Tony said, that may not, be very mobile, that move, disperse very far. The reality is, as Tony showed, we have very few true old growth forests. So we're not going to reach our goals, relying on true old growth. We've got to increase the accumulation of these characteristics across our landscape, and it can be done within the context of meeting your other goals, and it all adds up over time. One more advance, and I just wanted to go back. Sorry about that, Tony. I just wanted to make this point. There are a lot of conversations about, do you take a passive approach? Do you take an active approach? They're not, this isn't a zero-sum game. They are highly compatible, highly complementary, and they work with one another. And the trick is sort of evaluating the landowner goals, landscape context. We need both across the landscape. So no matter what role you seek to play, we need you across the landscape. Next slide. We're asked timing. So how does this play out? So, ecologically, you've seen this Hagen and Whitman slide picture that I'll show on the next slide as well. But, we're at a pretty good place ecologically from a timing perspective to pursue this, in the sense that many of our forests are 80 to 100 years old. And as we said, are starting to accumulate those characteristics. So this is an excellent time for both a passive and an active strategy to start adding to those, or speeding the accumulation of that up. If you were thinking about, setting the successional clock back for shade intolerant, that's something you should consider, and sort of weigh and balance the structural goals with the species composition goals. Deciding you want to pursue this after you've done, some intensive even aid management, means that you've got to wait extra decades. Right now, we're at about 100 years, and you've got to decide if you want to wait, more time with that. And then we've just got to face the reality of the social timing of this, which is the plurality of our landscapes are owned by family forest owners. Even organizations, communities, agencies all have sort of decision triggers as to when you pursue management. When landowners are thinking about this, it's an excellent time to introduce the idea and see how the strategy fits. Next slide. This takes decades. It can take more than a century. And so if this is something of interest to you, then documenting these areas both on the ground, and paint, and this is from our research plots, just showing, hey, this is a legacy tree that's meant to stay, documenting them in stand maps, GIS maps, GPS maps, taking waypoints, working them into a management plan to communicate to the next owner or owners, or the next forester that's going to be working on that unit, that, hey, this was intentionally left. This is, something that we hope will play out over the decades, over the century, or maybe it's in a baseline documentation report that you're showing where these reserve areas are. So really focusing in on these multi-decade, let's say century type of timeline, and combined with that is this huge need for combining these silvicultural strategies with conservation-based estate planning. That these strategies really work. They're only going to work. Let's put it that way. They're only going to work when they're combined with conservation-based estates planning strategies that ensure the forest is going to be there in 100 years. We just had a review come in to our publication last night, and I took a look at it, and the reviewer said, if it ain't there in 100 years, it's not worth doing. So what, as a landowner, if you're working with family forest owners, what can they do to ensure that forest is there in 100 years? It's critical to combine with these strategies. Next slide. So let's sort of distill this down a little bit. We have, a large audience, which is fantastic. We're thrilled that there's interest in this topic, and we've sort of segmented them out. So if you're a family forest owner, you're someone that is a part of the ownership of about 40% of the forests in New England, and so you're a really important group. And as I said, you play this really important role as really a stepping stone and hosting these kind of characteristics across the landscape. So I would encourage you to maybe, if you're interested in this, start thinking about how it fits in with your other goals. Is it primary? Is it complementary? Or how does it fit with what else you would like to achieve out there? I would encourage you, if you don't have a forester, to contact a forester and have him or her talk to you about sort of that landscape context piece and how these types of strategies might be able to fit into your goals. And I would implore you to start your conservation-based estate planning, whether or not it's specifically for these restoring old growth characteristics, or it's just for the other myriad of benefits that your forests provide to you personally and to the public. I would encourage you as a first step, sort of a complementary concurrent step as you're thinking about the specific in-stand strategies, to simultaneously start that estate planning. Next slide. If you're a forester, there are really, a couple ways that you can interact here. You can do so in a real reactive way, and that is, if a landowner says to you, gee, I'm interested in this, or I'm worried about, climate change, or I want to know more about how making my forest resilient, or I want older forest. This is a great opportunity to introduce some of these strategies. You can also do so proactively and incorporate this into your toolbox. Your sort of menu of options when you're evaluating stands and whole properties in terms of what you're going to do out there. Remember, you're that pulse of disturbance periodically. You have the ability to increase tree sizes. You have the ability to sort of make that increase the spatial variability. So while you're out there sort of thinking through what those options are and how you're going to retreat that, and it goes from that stand level even to the micro level. You're around a vernal pool, or you're in a filter strip area, or you're just in a unique area. You just sort of gut tells you it's sort of a unique ground to be walking on. These are all opportunities for you to sort of proactively encourage these kinds of characteristics, and they will accumulate across the stand. So, we used to, I guess I'm getting old. We really didn't learn about invasive plants when I was, going to forestry school, but we sure know about them now, and we're incorporating them now. Likewise, I would say, starting to incorporate this into your menu would be great. And again, it doesn't need to be all or nothing. You don't have to say we're going to do all passive or all active. It's the complement that's really powerful. And again, recognize you play this really pivotal role as an advisor to landowners to help connect them to resources on their conservation-based estate planning. You're helping them make multi-decade decisions anyway about this land that they love, and so you play a very appropriate role. You don't need to be an estate planning attorney or know the tax code in order to be, to connect someone to a local land trust or a peer with experience. Next slide. And so this last group is sort of singled out are, you might be a community leader, you might be a coverage cooperator or a master forest owner, or maybe you work for a land trust. Maybe your community owns land or your land trust has fee simple land. How do these strategies fit in? And again, you don't have to take this approach that our organization is all active or our organization is all passive. Take a look at the forest for its individual characteristics. Look at your mission statement. How does this all fit together? What is the landscape context? And make some decisions in terms of whether or not these strategies can help you achieve your mission while simultaneously adding to sort of the critical mass across the landscape. You too are also in a really critical role to work with landowners and be a demonstration area or talk to a landowner on a CR monitoring visit, maybe about the strategies if it seems right, or pass on resources that can help them, and certainly promoting these the conservation-based estate planning. Next slide. So with that, I just want to offer just some concluding points. As Tony pointed out, these are very rare, and the wonderful benefits we receive from these old growth areas, we don't have enough of it to receive all the benefits from old growth from the existing areas. We need to add to that. These are historically important. 70 to 9, probably upwards of 90% in many areas of the historic landscape were what we now call old growth. That's very important. There are both passive and active approaches, and importantly, they complement each other. They're compatible. So don't get put into a corner with one or the other. See how the property characteristics are individually within the landscape, within your, with each landscape has its own challenges, and make a good decision that's right for you or your organization. Remember that there isn't just, if Tony and I could just, if it were that easy, we would just send out a prescription and say, all right, here it is. This is the one thing everyone can do. But, sites are variable, landowners are variable, land use history is variable. We don't know what's coming down the line in terms of challenges and things. So this is the art and the science. So how can you incorporate these in a variety of intensities in ways that, match other landowner goals? And even just designating that one legacy tree out there, per stand or a handful of them or a patch, is really a powerful thing you can do. And as I hope I demonstrated with my dopey little diagram, it all adds up across the landscape. If everybody's doing a little bit, those stepping stones really matter. And again, the landscape context is really important. And then that last bullet is, you each play this really critical role. We have these wonderfully diverse landscapes of family forest owners, state lands, federal lands, land trust lands, municipal watersheds. We've got all kinds of great things, and that's a blessing and a curse. You each play it's a lot of people to reach, which is, I guess, the curse. The blessing is you have diverse goals, diverse objectives, and you really play this really important role ecologically within the landscape, contributing to one another, but you also play this really important role in the social landscape of helping landowners make good decisions, informing their decisions, and helping to encourage that conservation-based estate planning. So we would just like to acknowledge the organizations, Vermont Land Trust and our universities, the Open Space Institute, for this wonderful funding to get us going. And as we may have said that, Tony and I have been working on this for about 20 years. And so some historic funders include Harvard Forest and TNC. Certainly our project team up here in Vermont that's been, pivotal in terms of getting Tony and I up and going on this again and excited and challenging us to, sort of think through new strategies and ways in which this fits in. And if you haven't gotten the sense, we've benefited greatly from and continue to benefit from a group of reviewers across the region. This is in some ways a complex issue when you take it to this broad scale with all the conversations that are going on across the region. So we've really benefited from the experience and expertise of our peers, and we thank them. And I wanted to end with this slide. This is, when Tony and I first started doing this work, this slide kept resonating with us. It stands out, and there are two reasons I chose it to end with. The first is, our forests are ecologically young, and it just makes infinite sense to restore those structures and processes to them, to make them the true expression or the full expression for not only their own sake, but also our benefits and the many challenges that we're currently facing, and unfortunately, maybe facing in the future. So keeping every cog and wheel, these strategies, I think, help us maintain these or cultivate or restore these cogs and wheels. The other important part of this slide is the person who said it. And Aldo Leopold is really known probably best known for his land ethic and for his restoration principles and his active management. But I also want to point out that Aldo Leopold was a founding member of the Wilderness Society. And so to Aldo Leopold, it wasn't a black and white issue. The two pieces, active and passive, could and should, sort of live together and are important across that landscape. And so I think for both reasons, I wanted to include that slide. And if you can advance, Tony. And now I'm going to hand it over to Maya, but Tony and I really want to thank Vermont Land Trust for organizing this wonderful webinar and taking all the administrative role and so forth. So thank you very much, Maya, and I'll hand it to you.
Great, thank you so much. So we just have a list here of some upcoming events for folks that are in Vermont, a couple of events that you can see here that are open to everyone, and then a couple of events for professionals working in the field, a couple of field tours. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to talk further about those events. And you'll also, when you leave the webinar, be directed to a brief survey. We'd appreciate it if you could take that survey, and would love to hear your feedback about this event. And I think we will have just a few minutes to take questions here. So I know it is after 10, so if folks need to drop off to get to something else, thanks for joining us today. If you'd like to stick around, I will turn it over to Allie to ask a few questions.
Great. Okay, we have a lot of questions, so I'll do my best to sort of combine them a little bit. So the first comes from John McNerney. He's asking, if you have a stand that is lacking snags, what are some other ways you can create them besides girdling? And there was another question from Jake Meyer. Is there any benefit to partially girdling a tree?
Yeah, I can tackle that. I guess those that have tried girdling a hardwood know that often it is a partial girdle. It's pretty amazing how hard it is to fully girdle. But I think that, yeah, partial girdle is definitely one strategy, and even to an extreme, what some parts of the globe, like Australia, where they really have some critically threatened species that are cavity nesters, they'll actually introduce decay. So we'll deliberately try to they create a wound and introduce decay into the tree, and so. That's a pretty extreme example. So I think a partial girdle would be one way to at least induce that decay. I think the real key attribute is that heart rot is really what a lot of those cavity nesters are responding to. And so kind of something, what we don't want from a traditional timber perspective. And so those trees that are forming heart rot, it really is sometimes hard to predict that. But retaining even low vigor trees or poor quality trees, the things that we would have viewed as like unacceptable growing stock, those tend to really be often the critical future cavity trees in the site. So that'd be one. And then that partial girdle would be one option to try to kind of introduce some of that decay and kind of a slower death of that tree.
Great. There are a number of questions about, can you talk about marking legacy trees? What are your thoughts about using paint, tags, and thinking about the permanence of those legacy trees over time?
Yeah, I think, Paul mentioned certainly maps and digital resources, but, we and even paint, as you know, like doesn't last forever on trees. And so challenge with tagging is, again, you think that all of us have seen trees grown into some sort of fence or nail, so it's hard to kind of put a physical feature on the tree. What we've done is actually bury kind of a 10-penny nail or something near those trees. So like from a metal, like if you would know, like if the tree blew over, if it's all of a sudden missing, you kind of have like a metal detector or some monument near that tree that isn't visible, but that, would at least kind of cue you to what, like that's a legacy tree there for the future owner. But I think, given the quality even of like amateur GIS, GPS receivers and so forth, creating a digital map of where they are on the properties is pretty critical. And kind of an initial certainly marking, so that if somebody's operating out there, especially just dispersed retention or like they're cutting pretty close to those trees, really making it clear that tree is not meant to go is really important. But there's not a perfect solution to that. And I think, keeping maps up to date, making sure maps are documented and digital, I think probably one of the best ways to have that legacy documented. But if you really want to mark something in the field, even just putting something adjacent to that tree that you can find in the future, via metal detector or something like that might be one way to do it that doesn't impact the tree and might last a little bit longer than paint or a tag nailed onto a growing organism.
I would also add that, you know your organization the best, whether you're a consulting forester, maybe you work for an agency, but there might be systems in place that would be triggered when the next management forester comes along to work in that stand, that they could help communicate that. So communication in whatever form, whether it's just, verbally or in some combination, is really important. And you might have your own strategies, based on what your organization is. And I would highly encourage you to pass on what works and what doesn't to us too, because, you're the ones that are out doing it. And it would be great to hear, your experience.
Great. So Lynn Fitzhugh asked about if managing for old growth can be compatible with maximizing a balance between carbon sequestration and storage. And Beth asked, kind of along those lines, is how creating additional mortality and decomposition factor into carbon management goals?
Yeah, I think we didn't want to make this presentation about carbon because I think that unfortunately people are making it all about carbon, and that is it's a system that has many objectives, many values, and that we've learned a long time ago managing for a single objective is not a good way to think about a complex system. But in the carbon front, when we look at old growth ecosystems, and I think the question kind of this differentiating storage from sequestration is important in that, old growth forests, given the nature of the mass of the trees and the accumulation of dead wood and the organic material in the soil, have these tremendous stores, like high stocks of carbon, right? So old growth forest in particular, tend to have the highest amount of carbon stored on site. But the same token, as I mentioned, that spatial variability, that leaf area of that forest being allocated onto older trees that are just less efficient, with that than a younger forest. They don't grow as quickly collectively. And so sequestration rate, particularly of like a 30 to 60-year-old forest that's kind of transitioned out of that early forest development stage is higher than old forest. And so if we're trying to balance that, managing for old growth forest conditions, and even that stand I showed you where like there's 10th acre openings, quarter acre openings, we're leaving behind patches, we're thinning, we're retaining a lot of carbon on that site, right? So we still have a high level of storage, but we're also creating regenerating patches that are going to be quickly growing. And so over time, kind of the net sequestration, kind of the source, the strength of that sink will be a bit higher than, if we kind of had that naturally developing and grading. And so it certainly provides kind of an opportunity for that. In terms of felling those trees and creating dead wood, yeah, those trees are going to decompose and certainly respire, but at a fairly, that carbon loss will be certainly at a fairly low rate and will be counterbalanced by some other growth. But it certainly is kind of creating the logs that have always decayed in our forest and have always released some CO2. And I think the key is by having that vigorous growing forest and kind of that range of forest conditions, that net growth will be greater than any of the loss from carbon. And that's why, again, not to get too much into carbon, but when we look at kind of the checks and balances in an old growth forest, they're growing, but they're also losing a lot of carbon, right? So it's not a huge like net increment every year, every day that forest is fixing carbon. And so to kind of counterbalance some of that respiration and that loss, like having that mosaic and diversity of age classes is really going to be critical for that. So, and again, to my original point, not to keep going on this, we focused in on carbon there, right? So I dropped those logs. Oh no, like carbon's our only objective. We care about the respiration, but I dropped those logs, and it's such a key habitat that's lacking from our forest. And so we care about biodiversity too, right? And so I think we need to make sure, and it's a prime example of us, like we focus just on carbon, we totally, are blinded to so many other objectives we care about from our forest and some of the other things that are in great need of stewardship.
Great, I'll keep going, but Maya, give me the signal when we're wrapping up. Victoria Weber made a great point about deer overabundance and browse. Do you have any suggestions for folks about what we could do if that's an issue on your land?
Yeah, this is a real challenge with anything, right? We're doing, and even again, thinking about kind of our future forests, whether they're passively managed or actively managed, like deer are a huge impact. And so in those areas where we really are trying to recruit, new age classes, introduce that spatial variability. And if you're in a high, deer area, yeah, all of you know this, that are working in those areas, it has to be considered. Leaving some of that, dead wood, certainly, Paul, we showed the photo of the logs in our photos. Those are all kind of bucked up and left. Not, all of us could walk over those logs. So leaving kind of, felling and creating kind of a mess with those trees, mess maybe through our eyes, but I think a real great bonus ecologically might help. But I recognize that's just kind of one strategy that is effective, but not foolproof. Some people have gone to extremes of obviously using repellents or fencing or caging, but I think that's just economically and challenging. And so my argument would be, given we're trying to create a lot of that dead wood and those pulses, like if you're creating openings and trying to recruit trees, taking advantage of the fact that you're leaving tops, you're dropping trees in those areas and hoping that at least protects some of the regen, recognizing that where you have really high deer browse, even that's not effective at getting everything protected on the site. I don't know, Paul, given you live in an area with a little more than us for now.
Yeah. I'm going to do something I probably shouldn't do, but I'm going to go back to the previous question because I'm having trouble getting off of it. And that's that carbon question, which I guess we're all in some way stuck on. But just one point I want to bring up is I know for very good and obvious reasons, we're often focused at the stand level or at the property level. What's going on? Should I do this with my tree or should I do that with my forest? But I think it's equally important to take a look at that landscape level and see what's happening out there. When you take a look at our land use history, Tony's great graphic from the Ducey work about the age of our forests and their, uniformity, and it becomes really obvious that having, greater diversity at the landscape scale from an overall perspective is going to increase, the amount of resilience that we have out there. So, so yes, if you create, you lose some carbon storage on your property, which is 140 acres, but it's a unique area within, that landscape. It's not only going to have biodiversity benefits, but disturbances don't start and stop at boundaries either. So if a disturbance comes through, it's a part of helping that landscape be more resilient. So I know it's difficult because we all operate at a property level, because that's how we make decisions, but I would encourage you to consider the larger scale as well.
I think this will be the last question. I'm combining a few, there's a number of questions about wildlife that depend on old growth characteristics. And specifically, there was a question from Dan Wilder about the declining birds. Are any of those due to declining old growth forests? And are there other animals that we have here in New England that require those conditions?
So one of the differences maybe relative to other regions of the globe where they've really have talked a lot about old growth dependent like wildlife, and is that there still were large acreages of that on the landscape, such that you still had like viable populations that you could observe, that seem to be dependent on those. Like the leadbetter possum is an example from Australia that I was mentioning before in terms of the cavity trees. So in our region, we have so little old growth left that anything that had much of a home range that relied on old growth as a kind of the predominant cover type is likely, no longer here, kind of large charismatic organisms. But there are many things that certainly reach higher abundance in old growth forests or in ecosystems that have old growth characteristics, whether that be things like pine marten that rely on kind of large logs, right? And more complex, they're not old growth systems, but they certainly cue in on some of those attributes that seem to be more common in those. Even some understory plants that you don't think of as being like these hallmarks of an old growth ecosystem. Like a lot of Nichols' early work, kind of interesting in Connecticut when he was documenting these areas, pointing out things like hobblebush and Aurelia, like that were clearly more abundant, in these old growth forests than areas that were being cleared for agriculture and so forth. So we tend to have a higher abundance of these dispersal limited species, certainly these species that need, well-developed canopy structures and, in terms of some of our bird species. But in terms of ones that, are declining because there's no more old growth, sadly, that there already is like so little old growth that they're, so really what we're seeing declines in, and again, I'm not a wildlife biologist, and there's been some great reports that have summarized on these declines by the Vermont Center for Eco Studies and more broadly, is that it seems that those species that are mature forest obligates that either rely on certain insect populations that are being impacted by what's happening in agricultural fields and other landscapes, are being impacted by kind of loss of the habitat for some of those important food resources, as well as species that require young complex forest, right? So that clearly we have very little of that as well in the landscape, something that was historically created both by the activity of beavers and the activity of certainly indigenous peoples. All of those elements that are lacking from our landscape certainly are influencing those declines, and that includes these complex kind of old conditions that were found in these old forests. So it's really a full suite of things. But to your original question, it's just in our region, just nothing. Unfortunately, we just have so little left. We can't. We have really little understanding of what was lost in 1700 through 1900 when we totally eliminated all the old growth in the region.
Great, thank you so much. And I think that's unfortunately all the questions we have time for. So we are past 10:15, but thank you so much to all of you for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. It was a wonderful presentation. So thanks everyone for being with us this morning, and have a great day.